Hello and welcome to The Appetite, a podcast from the co-founders of Opal Food and Body Wisdom, an eating disorder treatment program in Seattle. I'm your host, Carter Umhau, a therapist at Opal and a writer and artist. The Appetite is all about bringing the themes of our work with eating disorders to the greater community. We talk about issues of food, body image, sport, and mental health, often asking the question of how a person could ask for more out of these areas of their life. If you've listened before, you'll know that we discuss radically open dialectical behavioral therapy quite a bit on the podcast, and that you'll hear us refer to it as RO or RO DBT most of the time. Opal co-founder Dr. Lexi Giblin is the RO DBT trained psychologist at Opal and has been implementing RO DBT into Opal's programming. This is a new treatment modality that is targeted for disorders of over-control, where a person is struggling because they are too controlled, rigid, or emotionally inhibited. Anorexia nervosa, autism spectrum disorders, obsessive-compulsive personality disorder, maladaptive perfectionism, and chronic depression and anxiety all fall in this category. The over-controlled temperament is the central concept at the heart of treatment for these disorders. You'll hear all of us refer to the temperament as OC, and its opposite, under control, as UC. Today, we are talking to Dr. Thomas Lynch and his wife and colleague, Erica Lynch. Tom is the creator of radically open dialectical behavioral therapy and developed the treatment out of over 20 years of clinical experience and research. The recording of this interview happened the week of the release of his books, an RO DBT skills manual and an in-depth training guide that includes theory of practice for clinicians. It's such a special treat to have Erica Lynch's voice in this conversation today, too, as she has played a central role in the development of RO DBT. Lexi and I were in the studio in Seattle together for this one, but Tom and Erica called in from rural France. So you'll notice the difference in sound quality on this episode because of this, but we hope you enjoy the conversation all the same. So tell us a little bit about the story of the creation of radically open dialectical behavioral therapy. My understanding that this is like a big moment in your work. So I want to get a bit of a background on what you were working on before this, how it all came about.
Yeah, and before you answer, Tom and Erica, I want to say how excited I am that we're on this podcast together, particularly at this moment, at this juncture in your career. With the book having just been released, and it's just an exciting moment.
Absolutely.
I know. It's a huge moment. We're really excited about it. It's amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's very exciting, and the book is bigger than I thought it would be. How about that? Both books are.
Wow.
There's a lot of work in there. Yeah, it started, gosh darn it, back at Duke University, I guess you might say, but probably my original, my work that I'd been doing prior to working on RO DBT was really focused on couples and really interested in concepts of intimacy and how couples managed intimacy in their relationships and conflict. And this was back about 24 years ago or so. I then got interested also in the concept of emotional expression. I thought it was an important mediator in depression and was related to some of the things I was studying with couples, meaning how people not just, might have suppressed or tried to inhibit thoughts or internal stuff, but how they might have inhibited or expressed or constrained expression of emotion. And so that's kind of the things I was working on beforehand. And then at the same time, I'd gotten to know Marsha Linehan, and as I got to know her, started to do some research with her. And that's how it kind of started with me thinking about using some concepts from standard DBT, at least initially, and applying it toward chronic depression. And so that's kind of how it started and what I'd been doing before. And then it just started building over time. First got some NIMH funding for our first trial, and found out right away that the people I was starting to select to treat that were chronically depressed were very different than the borderline patient that I'd been expected, or, kind of a dramatic, erratic, or under-controlled type of personality problem, which is what I'd been studying before at Duke University, where I was the director of the Duke Cognitive Behavioral Research and Treatment Program. So right away, I recognized that I had to do something different with this population. I remember one of my first patients that we started to apply, start to experiment with, and he had, I think he was diagnosed with paranoia and paranoid personality disorder and obsessive compulsive personality disorder and that kind of thing. Been depressed for 30 years or so and had lots of different treatments. And so I'm just sitting in the room and talking with him about the kind of the model that standard DBT had, which is an emotion dysregulation model. And I'm explaining to him that, we've got it kind of figured out about the kinds of problems he has, that he's a dysregulated, he's impulsive, he's out of control. And he kind of just sits there and just stares at me, very quietly and just says, "Okay, doc, that's what you think." And it's like with no expression. I realized right away there was something not quite right. And so it was really an iterative process for me of both, going to the laboratory and looking at some of the paradigms I was interested in, because I ran a basic psychophysiology laboratory as well. And then going back to the clinic and trying to understand the patients. And it was, I'd say the patients are the ones that really got me to begin to understand the idea of over-control and start to move toward it, I guess you'd say. Yeah.
Yeah, and I'd just like to jump in there. What's really interesting, those of you that know the skills, the Match Plus One skill comes from Tom's really early work with couples.
Will you explain the Match Plus One skill again for those that don't know it?
Yeah, Match Plus One is one of the skills we teach in, it's in the skill called Flexible Mind Allows. And it's a skill that's it really teaches people, I guess you might say, how to make a friend, how to actually establish a friendship with someone or establish a relationship. And the idea is that if you want to get to know someone, you first have to go up and talk to them, of course. And so but the way to get to know a person is you have to reveal vulnerable information. You have to reveal something personal about yourself. And so we teach the clients who often have no idea about how to do this. Other people seem to do it so easily, but our over-control clients often struggle greatly with figuring out this issue of getting close to people. So you reveal something personal, and then you kind of watch what the other person does, and if they want to, be engaged with you or want to get to know you a little bit, they're going to reveal something personal back. It may not be high level, and then if you like them and you like what they said, then you'll reveal something personal back to them. And then if they, match what's your level of intimacy, and then they go up one, they go a little bit more personal, they're sending you a strong social signal of connection. They want to get to know you. And, so you then do the same. You match their level of intimacy and you go up one, and before you know it, you're married. And that's how people get married.
So easy.
Is that what happened to you too?
Yeah, it's so easy.
Eric and Tom
figured it out.
So let's back up just a little bit. Mostly, we have talked about the podcast, or we've talked about RO on the podcast quite a bit. Some people might be listening for the first time. Some people might have a base understanding of RO, but I'd love for you to just give kind of a brief summary, because you've dropped some key phrases with the emotional expression and building of intimacy and over control even. Can you just give us kind of a quick summary of RO?
Wow, that's a good question, isn't it? A quick summary. Radical openness is based on the idea that first we start with the notion of what is mental health, you might say, or what is healthy living. We start with the notion that people that are doing okay in life, and you might think about people that you think are doing psychologically well right now for yourself, and it's okay if it's you, by the way. You think about people like that you think are doing okay. We believe they kind of have three characteristics that we think are important. And one is openness. They have a kind of open mind. They're willing they get criticized or they get discrepant feedback or they encounter something novel. They don't immediately reject it. They have some capacity, some willingness to take in new information. And that's how they can learn. That's how any of us learn. Is, because we don't know what we don't know. And then the other thing we think is important is flexibility. So a person that's doing okay, is emotionally healthy, is flexible, able to respond to changing circumstances. And the third thing we think is important, which we think our society sometimes is forgetting, which is that our species survived really, you might say we thrived. In fact, we basically quickly took over the world, you might say, as a species back, probably 200,000 years ago or so. This started happening for our species. We're a hyper-cooperative species. We're able to engage and collaborate with each other in a way that's unprecedented. So one of the key things for our survival is that if we're not in the tribe, we're for our primordial ancestors, living in really harsh climates, if you got ostracized from your tribe, you would die from predation or other kind of hardship. And in fact, there's research showing that's exactly what happens with primates. So a primate that gets separated from their tribe in this day and age will die within 4 or 5 days. So we really depend on other people a great deal. And so the third component for mental health, we think, or healthy living is social connectedness. But the good news is you don't need 150 Facebook friends to be socially connected. You only need one. Only need one
Another
friend.
Facebook friend.
Yeah, and probably not a Facebook friend. Yeah.
Exactly. That hasn't gone very well with me.
Kind of, it all starts, what is healthy about us, and then what it does is build from there and that type of thing.
Yeah. Was that brief enough? Because I was just going to mention temperament, but I don't know whether we're going to go there later on.
No, go ahead.
Because I think that one of the things that makes RO DBT different is that we look at the temperament the temperaments that are behind OC, and they're very, very different to the temperaments that are behind UC. In fact, most of them are kind of the opposite. And so the treatment is based around those temperaments, the deficits that occur because of those temperaments, and that's how the treatment kind of like builds.
So when you were talking earlier about couples work, I actually found myself really fascinated because I had no idea that was at the root of your own work. And that makes a lot of sense to me, that you would even start understanding couples as functioning sometimes as inhibiting or not expressing enough of their own emotion and therefore not being able to build intimacy. When you think about a population that's become as you would probably say, they have too much of a good thing of the over control. Beyond just the open expression, what are the other targets of RO?
Well, we target things. There's 5 OC themes that we think about. We think about aloof and distant relationships. We think about inhibited expression, which we've talked about. We think about rigid and rule-governed behavior. They have rigid rules that, a person that's over-controlled is, they're not the people that are causing riots and screaming and yelling at each other across the street. They're the people that are, they're kind of perfectionists. They see mistakes everywhere often, and including in themselves, frequently. And they were very good at planning ahead and persisting and those types of things. The problem is, they're really good at, you might say sitting quietly in a monastery or building a rocket. So they're very efficient in getting things done, but they often have, they're kind of clueless often about how to form relationships. We think part of that has to do with their temperament, and part of it probably also has to do with culture and the environment they were raised in. So it's a combination of both those factors interacting together to produce a coping style that's kind of constrained, over-controlled, rule-governed, and those types of things. So, for example, an over-controlled client, if you ask them, why'd you go to the party? They're not likely to say things like, oh, I wanted to go, or I was excited. They're likely to say, I thought it was the right thing to do. So they're often motivated, not necessarily by emotion per se, but by rules.
And social obligation.
Yeah.
I mean, we're probably going to talk about our temperaments later on, but like social obligation, I lean towards OC, and social obligation is a big deal for me. And it's interesting to watch how it's different in Tom. Maybe we can talk about that later on.
We should talk about it now. Yeah. I think it would be interesting to kind of get.
Okay.
Yeah, why not?
Yeah.
I think it would be interesting.
And in addition, I'd love to hear how this treatment, how your treatment has impacted your own lives personally.
Okay.
If you're willing.
Yeah. Well, it's funny that when we go out as a couple, most people might guess that I lean towards UC and Tom lean towards OC.
Why is that?
Tom is in a particular kind of mood. And when we set up today, it was me that did the talking. I have this obligation to try to make people feel okay, to make them feel at ease, to look competent, to be friendly, to be sociable. And because of my rule-governed nature, then I do that all the time. So even if I'm exhausted, I'll make an effort to do it. I probably don't do it quite as well when I'm exhausted, but I make a real effort to do it. Whereas if Tom is tired or is not interested, then he just doesn't make the effort.
In other words, my behavior is because I lean toward under control. And that's the point we're making here is what's nice is the data is very robust. It's been studied by people outside of our lab for sure. That in fact, that's how I really came across was running into someone like Leanna Clark and people like that study these things. But there's just two different types of personality that they've kind of discovered. And then one is under controlled, one's over controlled. And under controlled individuals, one of the things you might say their behavior is based on how their mood is in the moment more rather than the future consequences, that type of thing. And that's why, for example, standard DBT works so well for them, as they need to learn how to, get their act together, to inhibit their emotions sometimes, and to tolerate distress better and those kinds of things. But if you already have too much of inhibitory control and you're very excellent at stress tolerance, what do you need? You need more inhibitory control. You need to learn how to regulate better. Well, no, we don't think so, because their behavior are social. The temperament they have, for example, of threat sensitivity makes them more likely for them to walk into social situations with what we call their hunting dogs, swords and shields, things that they bring with them based on their temperament, the over-controlled client that we're talking about here, that make it difficult for people to want to connect with them.
And can I jump in there?
Yeah.
Because I think this is something that I struggle with, just kind of like talking about going to parties. And I know that some of my OC colleagues have the same thing, that if I go into a party and lots of people are talking in groups, I really struggle with walking up to either, even if I know people a little bit, and kind of like butting into the conversation. So when I walk into a party, I'm really quite anxious, whereas I know that Tom can just walk up to people and kind of like interrupt and start talking to them, and then he might walk away again. And, it's really interesting to see the differences in our behavior. And you asked about how it's affected as a couple. It's been really helpful for me to see that there's a different way of being, because I grew up in a family that was all OC. All of my family were OC. And that was I just thought that people were like that. And to see how different I could be if I can kind of like get out of my OC way of being has been a huge awakening for me. And yet there's struggles, because I'm rule governed and I like things to be very tidy, and Tom's much less tidy than I am. There's times where I've really got to look at what are my priorities. Is it more important that the room's tidy, or is it more important that I get on with Tom?
Yeah, I think that it's impacted us in many different ways. One of the things we haven't talked about is in a radical openness is this concept of self-inquiry, which is a new way of thinking about mindfulness, and it comes from a tradition called Malamati Sufism. And it's a way of actually learning to create what we call a sense of healthy self-doubt, which we believe is one of the secrets of healthy living as well. Meaning to walk into situations and have the capacity to not immediately reject or try to regulate or defend against or deny or accept or whatever. To actually have the willingness to take in feedback that you don't want to hear or you dislike for a temporary period of time, and be willing to consider that perhaps your perspective is incorrect and you might need to learn, because that's the only way you grow, is you have to encounter your personal unknown. So I guess for me personally, I think that self-inquiry has really enriched my life, and I think it's enriched our couples' experience.
I think it helps us both recognize that our way of being, my personal way of being, isn't necessarily the right or the only way, and to accept Tom's very different ways and to love him for them, not just to put up with them, but to actually love him. I can remember talking to Leanna Clark once, who's a well-known researcher on personality disorders, and she talked about UCs as having tolerance for chaos.
Meaning under control.
Under control, UCs, having tolerance for chaos. And so that's really helped me. So when I walk into Tom's office, which, wow, you should see Tom's office. I don't know how he finds
it chaotic.
Anything, but he always seems to find it. And when I walk in, I have this urge to try to tidy it up or at least take some of the dirty glasses away, so that I can wash them up. And then when I tell myself, that he has greater tolerance for chaos than I do, then I can see that actually, what he has is a strength, and my rigid way of seeing it isn't necessarily the right way to be. So I know there's lots of things like that.
There are. And I
do I do anything to help you?
Yeah, of course.
I know, I was wondering the same thing.
I was going to say right now, which is because Erica brought up this idea of chaos and things, and I just want to make sure people recognize, though, that over-controlled individuals doesn't mean all of them are very neat and clean and orderly, and that would be one thing that would confuse someone. For example, you can't go by how they dress. They might look very dramatic in their dress, and the reason they might dress that way is because they see themselves as separate or different. It's a social signal to society to stay back, even perhaps. And if you think about obsessive-compulsive personality disorder, one of the criteria is hoarding, and and we used to do home visits for some of our OCPD clients, and their houses are absolutely a cluttered mess because their over-control is out of control. They're saving everything for the future. That's what hoarding is. It's saving something instead of just in case you might need it, saving for the rainy day, which is really a great adaptive thing for our species to have developed, but you can have too much of it and then that type of thing. So it's, it's really interesting that it's starting to come out, though. The data is very compelling about these two different personality styles. And what's nice is we think we might have figured out a way to help people with it. So good.
That's remarkable.
Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit about the application with eating disorders as well.
Yeah.
I can already think through kind of how the hoarding or the way that you just described this sort of like messiness might actually kind of come out with clients that are really, really struggling with eating disorders and maybe have gotten to a place where indeed their over control has gotten out of hand a little bit. But kind of broadly, how would RO DBT work for a client with an eating disorder? How does this all play out?
Okay. Well, basically we start with the premise, and it's based on the research data, which shows that what's interesting is over control and the same goes for under control, these personality styles. You can start to see them in kids as young as 4 years old. There's a really famous experiment that's been done a lot. It's called the marshmallow experiment, where you give a kid, you go into a room and you say to a little child, 4 or 5 years old, and say, I'm going to give you a marshmallow, and if you don't eat it, I'm going to have to leave here for a minute, but if you don't eat it and I come back and you haven't eaten it, you're going to get another one. You'll get an extra one. So meaning if you can delay gratification, if you can inhibit, the desire to want to eat the marshmallow right then. And it turns out right around then, about age 4 or 5, there's really clear differences between kids you can see. And we know that inhibitory control is a temperament. There's a part of your brain that develops value to do that. And so I guess when it comes to eating disorders, then like anorexia would be what we'd call as a classic over-controlled type of personality style. At least that's what the data shows. Over-control starts before they have the eating disorder problem. And if you think about restricted eating, that takes a lot of inhibitory capacities. It's a lot of self-control to not eat when your body is screaming for food, might say. And so one of the things that we're able to do is recognize that right away, and the clients get it. So when we talk to the over-controlled anorexic, say, for example, and talk about, were they perfectionistic, were they shy or timid, did they kind of, do they tend to be rule-governed and maybe not express a lot of emotion, that type of thing, perhaps be conscientious and constrained and work hard, things like that. They'll really identify very readily with that early, and that's what we've shown in our data as well.
I've got something else which doesn't get talked about as openly quite so often, but over-control people get a lot of satisfaction. Maybe their reward comes more from assisting at something, persevering at something, and being able to kind of like acknowledge that they've done really well at something. And Tom uses an example often that over-controls might not get so excited if they win the lottery because it was kind of like chance, but if they've had to run a marathon and they've had to train, like for 6 months beforehand, and they've got up at 4 o'clock in the morning every morning to go training, then that's kind of where they get their reward from. So we also think that there's a part of the reward system that can be brought into play by the not eating, because they can develop a real sense of pride, as well as this kind of like a perverse reward from not eating. So something that doesn't get talked about very often, but I do think it's a very important part of the whole thing.
Yeah. And so I guess what we're saying is that big thing with RO DBT is that we don't really focus on the food or that type of thing. We consider that to be, kind of a side effect of over-controlled coping. And we really talk more about where does a client want to go in life? How do they want to live? And we talk a lot about social signaling, because we're actually the first treatment in the world to ever target social signaling, because we, as I mentioned before, because of the temperament issues they have, for example, if you get threatened, I don't know if you've ever had this experience where threatened or anxious, what happens is you're actually, your face, it gets hard to actually express your emotions very easily, especially friendly pro-social emotions if you're threatened. So, for example, and I think we all have had this experience, you're feeling anxious or really upset about something, and you're trying to be friendly to someone, but the smile's phony and fake. So you actually can sense it. And the thing is, people read that as well. So the data is clear. So the over-control client has kind of the struggle for them is that they've got a temperament that they were born with that's different than others, and that starts to emerge in young childhood, and then their attempts to try to cope with it by, avoiding risk or inhibiting their emotions, masking feelings, because if you mask your feelings, then people won't find you to be out of control. They're basically, they want to be in control at all times. Often that's what their culture and their family sometimes teaches them that as well. So, you do those things. And then, or you don't get close to people, because getting close to another person requires you to reveal vulnerability. And so, if you reveal vulnerability, that means you might be doing something wrong. So avoid appearing like they made a mistake or those kind of things. Again, if you think of them as often having kind of a perfectionistic way of living, then you can start to see why they might start to behave in these ways. And the problem, unfortunately, is it sets up conditions where people don't really want to hang out with them so much. They inside, they feel like people don't like them. They feel isolated. They feel, they're often described as shy or timid kids when they were young, and that type of thing. And so the way of protecting themselves or controlling their emotions internally functions as a powerful social signal that you might say isolates them from other people, because people find it off-putting when a person's not being genuine in how they're expressing or not really revealing much vulnerability, because that's how you get to know someone. It's like I always say, if you think about your friends, what do you like about them? Is it because they just got back from Hawaii and they've got a nice tan and they're buying their third boat and getting their third PhD? Of course you like them for that. But I think you probably like them because they also told you things about themselves that they're not always proud about, or they've struggled with, they worry about. And that's what we mean by intimacy. It's not just the good things to find out about someone. It's also the things that a person might struggle with. And why is that important to reveal to someone? Well, it sends a powerful social signal. It says two things. One, I trust you because we don't reveal vulnerability to someone we don't trust. And two, that you and I are the same, because we all know that we've made mistakes in life and that we all could do better and that we're fallible. So it kind of does, it's a very powerful thing. And what we do is help our clients really learn the skills to be able to socially connect again, to get back in the tribe, you might say. Yeah. But less focus on food-related behaviors, although we don't ignore it. more focus on social signaling and social connectedness, you might say.
One of the things that I've noticed with working with eating disorder clients is that it feels like oftentimes the focus or the obsession with food or body becomes kind of the number one thing in their lives. So maybe a leaning toward that because of their over-controlled temperament has sort of taken the place of many other desires. I feel curious what you guys would say about that in terms of how to use self-inquiry around that, how would a client learn to connect and maybe reveal deeper things when they might be really hyper-focused temperamentally on food or body.
Yeah, we see that, of course, and we don't think about it a whole lot. We start really back with the client. Where do you want to be? What kind of life do you want to live? It's your life. It's your choice.
And I think very early on when we talk about goals and values, which we do in the first couple of sessions, we always make sure that we have goals and values that aren't just to do with the body or what you look like, and that there are some goals and values that are to do with relationships.
Yeah.
And I think that, that's really important because then throughout treatment, what we do is keep referring back to those goals and values, which is what provides the incentive for the client to start to think about things differently.
So I guess what I'm saying there, I don't know, I hadn't thought about this a whole lot right now, but something like I'm kind of bored by it a bit. It's not, it's the client's, choice. It's their life. If they want to think about their body a lot, how about that? My question to them would be something like, are you happy? Do you have a good time doing it? To getting you where you want to be in life? All those kind of things. And then, but really I want to say to them, you have anyone that actually, you give a damn about and gives a damn about you? Do you have anyone that we might say is a genuine friend? These are the kind of things we start to then move toward. So I don't know if I'm exactly getting at your question, but those are a couple of thoughts I have about it.
I think you are getting at it.
And can I just jump in there about the self-inquiry? Because I think that sometimes people think that self-inquiry should be about like the big things, the big problems that we have. And my personal experience is that my self-inquiry is most useful to me when it comes up around the little things, but it's the little things that come up a lot. Why is it that when Tom says this, I get upset? Or why is it when I come across that I get upset? The things that come up regularly that create some energy in me, those are the places that I can really grow because those are the patterns, my coping patterns that are maybe getting me stuck. Whereas, I don't know, like a huge, big...
Yeah, and I guess just to add on what Erica's saying, and then we should, go elsewhere, I guess. But when she used the word why, I think that we wouldn't use the word why exactly in a self-inquiry practice because that implies that we're looking for a cause. Mm. But what we would say is there something here for me to learn? A more open kind of minded, that kind of it's a broad question that we teach our clients to learn to begin to ask themselves when they get something they don't like or in a novel situation, for example, or something like that, and that type of thing, and then see what emerges. There's a whole way we teach it to the clients. So I don't know if are we kind of hitting the mark for you guys with that, or is there something else you want to know about?
Yeah, I think so. I was laughing earlier because I could tell you were. I was aware of imagining that you're bored answering that question.
Oh gosh, yeah.
And it's what we get asked all.
I know. So, but one thing I do want to touch on because it is so different in RO DBT versus treatment as usual in eating disorders is kind of and something we've been changing dramatically at Opal is how we respond to clients who are refusing to eat food when they're in treatment. And I wonder, could you share some of your thoughts on that? So if a client is saying, I can't do it, I just can't do it. I can't eat this food you've put before me.
What can't you do? Can't eat what?
You can't eat
food in front of you?
Yeah, the fruit in front of me.
You literally can't pick up that fork and can't do that, huh?
Well, I could. I'm just so anxious. I can't do it. I'm so anxious about it.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah. Well, I don't know. I guess you could just see by that little thing I did there. I mean, it's part of, I guess, the way we think about it is I mean, it's just true for all of us. I think we all have a story about ourselves, about the world and how it works. And it's always evolving, of course, but often our story about the world and ourselves keeps us stuck too in the places that sometimes not places that are healthy for us. And so part of our work with a client like that would be helping them recognize that it's their choice. No one's forcing them not to eat. They're making a decision to not pick up that. And that it is true, anxiety occurs, but yet, from an RO perspective, how about that? Isn't that amazing? Look at that anxiety. We really think that anxiety and emotions are part of life. I've had plenty of emotion today. I don't know about you guys, but there's obstacles all the time, all kinds of things going on in the world with things. And so instead of kind of worrying about having to feel good before I can live well, we actually try to help a client recognize that you can social signal according to your values, you can live according to your values. And we think that if you get connected, the data is clear on this, if people that are connected with at least one other person, they feel naturally calmer and they feel less anxious because they know someone has their back. They know that if they're in trouble, they've got someone they could contact who would be there to help them and be willing to make self-sacrifices for their benefit without always expecting something in return. So, our focus is if you get in tribe, if you get to feel connected and something changes and the food just becomes less salient. And that's what our clients tell us. It just doesn't seem as important once they start to figure out finally how to get closer to other people. And that's, so that's kind of what we see happening.
Makes sense. It does make sense. It feels inspiring in so many ways to be thinking of how we just take food out of the equation. I think that's hard for me in some ways because I'm like, oh, there's a lot of information there. So for the purpose of self-inquiry, it seems great. But then on the other hand, too, I love that you guys are saying, like, can we just talk about something else, too? Can we talk about something else? Yeah.
This is funny because there's a history with this whole way of doing things. 10 years ago, I was asked to go to the Halden unit, which is an anorexic unit in the UK. And that's where we did our first trial with RO DBT with anorexia adults. And one of the things I used to go on the unit and hang out a lot and spend time with the staff and the patients and things. And during one of the consultation team meetings, someone was talking about a client, and all they were talking about, was food and those kind of things, and how the client was cutting a pea up into 27 different pieces or something like that. And I just sort of made a suggestion. This is very early days for us. And I just said to the therapist, well, next session, why don't you go in and just tell the client you're not going to talk about food at all this time or anything like that, and just see what happens. And what happened is the clients reported they got highly anxious. They actually found talking about, this is what they reported us, they found talking about food or restricting behavior or calorie intake or exercise and things of that nature to actually be kind of soothing, you might say, comfortable. It gave them a sense of identity and purpose, and that type of thing. And then as soon as we took that away, at least you might say for a session, all of a sudden they were faced with the fact that they're much more than just their eating disorder. They're not just their eating disorder. And that's what we try to help the client recognize. And then that's when they first start to make the step. It's really nice to see. Yeah.
I find myself, still really curious about, just what social signaling can do for this. Especially, I don't know, we've talked a lot about overly agreeable and overly disagreeable clients at Opal. I'm not sure we've talked about it a ton on the podcast, but when we're talking about social signaling and open expression of emotion, I think oftentimes I've heard clients assume that they're being they're talking about stuff already. They're feeling warm. They're feeling connected. They're feeling all these things, or at least trying to. They're acting like that, but not internally. They're not actually experiencing closeness because maybe they're avoiding conflict, for instance. Can you talk a little bit more about kind of how these two subtypes would be struggling to express themselves, and how one would go about that, changing that?
Maybe I can start because I lean towards overly disagreeable. although I don't have an eating disorder. I love my food. I can certainly talk about what my struggle is as an overly disagreeable. So I can look like a real toughie. I'm quite, because of my social obligation, I'm usually quite polite and nice and chatty. So it's when I start to get pushed or I'm faced with something that I don't like, that my automatic reaction is to fight. So I can get disagreeable. I can get tough. I don't get loudly angry. I get cold and angry. And if it starts to heat up, then I walk away. I don't like conflict. I hate to admit that I don't like conflict because I like to think that I can handle it because I'm a toughie. But I really don't like it at all. It upsets me a lot. And so I walk away. And I walk away from relationships. I used to walk away from relationships where there was a lot of conflict. I'm learning now to hang in there. And interestingly, I can't ever remember my mom showing any anger ever. So I don't think that I ever learned how to express it in a reasonable way, or I don't think I ever learned anything about it at all. So in terms of an overly disagreeable, what I need to learn to do is to be more vulnerable, is to show my soft belly. Because I'm a real marshmallow inside. I'm a real soft. And I think that my tough exterior is to protect my real soft underbelly. And what I have to learn to do is to show people that. It's funny, as I'm talking now, I can just feel some tears in my eyes as if, I'm saying something tough to say this, but it's an important thing for me to say, that I need to show people that, that I'm soft, that I'm vulnerable. And it's getting easier for me to do because I've been working with Tom a long time and he's really helped me.
Yeah, so the overly disagreeable subtype as far as social signaling is because all over-controlled individuals want to be seen as competent. But the overly disagreeable wants to be seen as competent and not a wishy-washy or weak, you might say.
Yeah.
So they're more likely to signal with a flat face. They're less likely to show emotion, especially under stress. They're less likely to do conspicuous cooperative signaling like head nods or smiling, those kinds of things, especially under stress again. Whereas the overly agreeable subtype also wants to be seen as competent, but also socially desirable. So they too will walk away from relationships, but they'll do it in a way that no one ever knows they're actually walking away. It's something like, oh, don't worry, I'll get back with you, I'll call you. And then they never do, things like this. So, it's the subtypes and their signaling is different. The overly agreeable subtype is likely to be doing excessive cooperative pro-social signaling that actually comes off in a phony way. They'll have a sing-song voice, and the problem is that it's fine to be, head nodding and smiling a lot, but when it's done at a time when you're talking about, like, say, well, I just found out that my husband's having an affair, and they're smiling about it, and I burnt the house down. How's your day going?
Oh, so unsettling.
It just doesn't work either way, and so both subtypes have different ways of social signaling that can get them in trouble with people wanting to connect with them. And the thing is, people are polite. We're a kind species. So most of the time, the only time you're ever going to get feedback about your interpersonal social signaling will be from your spouse or a very close friend or a therapist. That's about it.
Yeah, I was just thinking, one of the things that you asked earlier on about what's it like being, using RO in our relationship. And Tom sees my flat face before I realize that my face has gone flat. And so he'll say, what's the matter? And I'll say nothing. And he'll say, well, your face has gone flat. And I think, oh, shit, not again. Really tough.
So funny. It's so funny. I mean, we obviously can't see you since you two are on the phone. But even as you were speaking and kind of putting on these overly disagreeable and overly agreeable kind of personas, the whole room in here just kind of like reacted. Yeah. Our own bodies really responded to that. I found myself particularly cringing with the overly agreeable, like, oh, I don't know what this all means. You know, how do I actually respond to this?
And
Yeah,
I noticed when you were describing overly agreeable, I've been looking at Carter and like nodding and smiling this whole time, and looking over at Kara and Julie and smiling and going. And so I cut that out for a minute.
Yeah, and that fact, there's one of the skills we teach has really applicability to the different subtypes, and it has to do with what's called indirect social signaling. So the thing about over-controlled individuals, they are, of course, are social signaling. We all are. Social signal is any behavior you do in front of another person, you know, even if it's not intentional, as a social signal. So if you yawn in front of another person and you don't intend to give them a message about anything like they're boring or anything, but the other person's brain is hardwired to take any behavior that they experience when they're around another human as a signal of social inclusion or not. Because remember, being in a tribe was essential for our primordial ancestors, so our brain still responds just like it did back in the early days. And so we take any signal that comes from another person that's not conspicuously clear as a genuine signal of friendliness. And we can tell whether a smile is phony or fake, all kinds of things. We're good at reading this at an unconscious level, and that's what the data shows. So, you know.
Can I just finish up your sentence then?
Yeah.
So if a signal isn't conspicuously pro-social and genuine, then we read it as a negative or
it's a non-engagement signal.
A non-engagement signal.
Or actually could be like a disapproval signal.
So a flat face might not have any emotion, intention behind it as a negative one, but another person might read it as a negative thing.
Yeah.
Because there's no deliberate pro-social stuff there.
It's really funny because you look at Hollywood, and they figured this out because the villains that they use in movies often have a flat face. That's what makes them so scary, because there's this conspicuous absence of pro-social signaling in a situation that calls for it, and those kind of things. But what I was going to say is that there's two different types of signaling. There's one that we see with the overly disagreeable more often. It's called a pushback type of behavior that is a social signal, and it's used as a way to, I guess essentially you say to block feedback you don't want to hear, or to block requests to join in the community or to participate in your tribe. And let's have Erica demonstrate this. Let's see if this will work. Erica, could you show everyone right now what a pushback would look like?
What do you mean show? We're on the telephone.
Oh, could you demonstrate, though, just through words then, what a pushback might look like?
What do you want me to do that for?
Well, because you often help me out with things like this. It'd be really helpful if you could show a pushback. Do you mind doing it?
Well, I think that's you've got a big problem with this. I don't understand why you want me to do this right now.
Okay, but you usually help me out with things. I mean, I don't know what's going on.
I think you're the professor here. I think that you can kind of sort this out without me, don't you?
Okay, so that's called a pushback. And a pushback...
I'm really good at those.
You're really good, Erica.
Those most.
You're really good.
So, in that example, you could see what happened is what makes indirect social signaling, which is the way, the style of social signaling an over-controlled person has, is that it has plausible deniability. So I could say to this person, Eric, I could say, you seem like you're angry or whatever. And she could say, I'm not angry.
Telling you what I think, that's all.
Yeah. And so, but if you notice in this case, actually she's in a tribe that actually it's part of her job to help me out. And so here it is, it's odd. But notice it's got that plausible deniability. First thing she does is I say, could you do this? And she says, why do you want me to do that? So instead of, she puts it back on me. And it's just an example of that. How indirect social signaling really impacts other people, but it allows the person to not take responsibility for the decisions or choices they make or those types of things, or for the fact that they're impacting other people. Now, the other type is called a don't hurt me response, and it's more likely to occur in the overly agreeable subtype. And Erica, could you demonstrate for us what an overly a don't hurt me response might look like?
Sure, I'd be happy to do that, Tom. But, I think we're probably running out of time now. So I think, maybe we should just kind of move.
Yeah, but I think we have some time. I think it'd be really helpful for people to see the don't hurt me. Do you mind doing that?
Tom, I've told you this before. If you really like me, you wouldn't ask me to do these kind of things.
Oh, I know, but, you're here to help me out on this call today, and I would think that...
I'm getting a headache now, Tom. This is just so hard.
Okay, so that's called a don't hurt me response. And
Very familiar.
It's a kind of behavior that's learned, and what it does is that both of these behaviors function to block, joining something. So in this case, I asked her to help me out with something, and it actually, basically puts the problem back on me, because it basically is saying there again, if I was a nice person, don't I see I'm not a caring? And so therapists or everybody often has a tendency to soothe the person, which actually reinforces it and take the heat off them. So we teach the clients about all this. So we teach them everything about social signaling, and it's kind of cool because they like it.
Hard to do again.
They like it too. They've known they've been doing this for a long time. Yeah.
It's really asking them to step up to the plate and be responsible for what they're really feeling, which I don't know. I've been thinking honestly a lot about I've been thinking about a conflict I had with my partner last weekend, actually, when we've been talking about this, because maybe it's because you said that you had initially started with couples work, but just noticing like, wow, if you are kind of trying to inhibit your emotions so much, and then you start leaning in the category of, oh, I can't do that, or, oh, I'm feeling, these pushbacks and don't hurt me's, they really can get in the way of mutuality in a relationship. And I mean, I know that. I've been thinking of that cognitively for a while, but it can still happen. And the emphasis on actually going out of your way to out yourself or to share what's happening for you before you get to the point of that can really allow two people to stay on the same playing field. And the direct communication, pursuing direct communication can clearly increase intimacy so that you're not just, I don't know, enabling someone constantly or walking on eggshells.
Yeah. And from a selfish point of view, you're more likely to get what you want because you're actually being direct about what it is that you want or what it is that you're unhappy with. Because the indirect stuff leaves the other person guessing what the problem is, and they can't help you solve it if they don't know what it is. So
might as well come out with it. Really well, we are just about at time, but were there any final questions from Lexi or?
Well, the one question that's lingering for me is around over-controlled temperament and bulimia and binging and purging, and it seems like there's an assumption that you can't be over-controlled in your temperament and have binging and purging symptoms. And so I wanted to get your thoughts on that, Tom and Erica.
Yeah, I think that broadly speaking, I mean, I'm kind of, as a scientist, I'm very cautious about making statements that I haven't, that need more research. And I think, I'm working with Maudsley right now, it's in London. It's an eating disorder center that we're doing research with on this. And we believe it's possible that there may be individuals, you can learn anything, by the way. So binge purge typically is, the research links it with, poor persistence and poor planning and poor inhibitory control and impulsiveness and things like this. However, I'm working with the population for a while. Many have noted that it seems that there's some individuals that might, lean toward over-control that develop this kind of binge purge way of behaving. And so we're still trying to sort it out a bit. One thought we have is that it's like anything in life. There's so much, you only have so much self-control, and at some point everybody's got a breaking point. So if you're really hungry and you're starving yourself, you're inhibiting, restricting, say you're an anorexic, and then you meet, at some point you get, you decide to eat, and then it would be highly reinforcing at that point. There's a part of the brain that's associated with laying down learning and that type of thing that's reward learning. And when you're like really thirsty, say you're in the desert and you haven't had water for a long time, you drink water, it's going to be highly associated with hedonic value and learning. So I think there's lots of ways things like that could happen. I think that this is an exciting time for us to start to look at those kind of constructs, and I know people are.
I think another thing that's important as well is to, when somebody says they binge, is to actually dig deep to find out, how much did they really binge? Because I know that, for example, I love chocolate, but I can only eat 3 or 4 pieces of chocolate. And to me, a binge would be eating 6 pieces of chocolate. To Tom, binging would be eating 3 bars of chocolate, and I could never eat 3 bars of chocolate. So I think, what they report, it's really important to dig down into it to find out how much did they actually do?
And how much did they plan it? How much was it based on mood dependency, or did they plan it ahead, and things like that? Because it'll give you a sense. It's the same thing with self-injury and those kind of things, because it occurs as well with over-control. And it's often planned and done privately and this kind of stuff. So,
but I know you thought about this, Lexi. I'm interested to hear your thoughts, because I know you've thought about this a lot.
Yeah, I have thought about it, and I love the idea of thinking about eating disorders as either under-controlled versus over-controlled eating disorders, because the current diagnostic system doesn't speak to over-control, which is such over-control and under-control. So we see so much, subjective binging and planned purges and purges to kind of correct mistakes of eating, that kind of thing. So we're really used to seeing that around OPAL in our clients.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that Ruli and I are just trying to set up now is a clinician-based or a clinic-based research group. So hopefully we're going to be in touch with you in the future to help you start to collect data on this kind of stuff, because it's going to be really important that we, have some empirical evidence around it too.
Yeah, great.
Well, thank you so much for joining us and talking to us about RO.
Such a treat, Tom and Erica. Yeah. And so great that, Erica, you were able to join us.
Well, thanks for the invitation. Did we talk too much? I feel as though we've done lots of talking.
No, it's been fine. It's been great to learn so much.
Yeah, well, we really appreciate it, and it's been fun. It's been enjoyable talking with you guys.
Oh, good.
So,
and it's our dinner time now.
Oh, good. What are you going to have? Anything good?
It's almost 7 o'clock in the evening.
Oh, funny.
But like a good OC, guess what I did this afternoon? I prepared our dinner first.
I do. I took a nap.
Thanks again to Tom and Erica for joining us at this special time for RO DBT. And thank you for listening. If you were intrigued by anything you heard, make sure to check out previous episodes on RO and its application in eating disorders, sport, and in relationship. We even have a heartfelt episode talking about forgiveness as it's seen through an RO DBT lens. So if you're looking to get deeper into RO, check that out. Also, go ahead and subscribe to The Appetite on iTunes so you can be notified when our next episode comes out. And if you want to stay in touch with us, find us at opalfoodandbody.com or follow Opal on Facebook and Twitter. We would love to talk to you via email as well, so send any questions or comments at theappetite@opalfoodandbody.com. Thank you to Cloud Studios and to Jack Straw Cultural Center for the use of their beautiful recording studios and for sound engineering. Thank you to Aaron Davidson for The Appetite's signature music and to Sarah Taylor for production assistance and editing. Talk to you guys next time.